This is part 3 of the Mark highlight reel. First, a condensed summation looking at the chapters overall. For part 3, chapters 10 through 13, we get the beginning of Holy Week, about the first half. Chapter 10, the first part of it, is about self-sacrifice. Verses 1 to 12, Jesus uses Genesis 1:27 and 2:24 in a very literal sense to explain that the only reason ancient Israel was allowed what we'd call no-fault divorce is because their hearts were so hard that there'd be no exemplary nation without it. See, ancient Israel was supposed to be like the church today, an example to all other people of people who are obedient and faithful to God. Well, if God didn't allow this, then there would be nobody to do that. Because if Israel wasn't, because if that was a deal breaker for Israel, then it was a deal breaker for everybody. As in other words, they would not have been able to hold up to that standard. And Jesus also says that divorce wasn't an original part of marriage, nor was it given to ancient Israel with the intent to be permanent. And divorce is only for very few circumstances. I think it's fair to explain it like this. Divorce is only acceptable for ongoing/unending adultery, abandonment, and or abuse. Without any of those things, divorce is not reasonable. And really, you ought to first wait for multiple circumstances of that happening, and then separate first. And then finally the divorce. That should be a very last resort, if you're even going to do it. And then Jesus also says that, anyone who can't handle this heat should then just be celibate. Can't handle marriage with no-fault divorce? Then don't get into it. Next, verses 13 to 16, Jesus says that the kingdom belongs to children and that one must receive the kingdom like a child. And, becoming spiritually like a child has to do with being born again. When you're biologically born, you become a biological child. When you're spiritually born, that is being born again, you spiritually become a child. And then finally, verses 17 to 31, a rich man calls Jesus good while not knowing he's God. In this rich man's eyes, he's just calling a regular human being good, which such a thing doesn't exist. And then he asks how he can be saved. And after Jesus responds with saying, you know the commandments, not to give him an answer to how to be saved, but just to make a later point, the rich man then lies about having kept the commandments. He says, yeah, I've kept them. Yeah, right. Somebody hook him up to a polygraph. And so then Jesus tells him to go sell his idol, which is his wealth, because he was breaking the first and second commandment through his greed. And then Jesus explains that it's impossible for a man by his own power to keep the moral law and to enter the kingdom that way. And that doing so is only possible by God's power. Hence, why God became a human being, lived the sinless life, kept the moral law as we couldn't, and did so on our behalf, dying and then rising again as well, so that by God's power and we can put our trust in it and then be saved. And Jesus also says that whoever surrenders to him by putting their trust in him, as I said earlier, and therefore sacrifices in doing so, because, law of non-contradiction, if you're going to follow Jesus, then you can't follow worldly things, you got to sacrifice them. And finally, he says that many who are first will be last, and vice versa. The rest of the chapter is about bruises, brothers, and beggars. Verses 32 to 34, Jesus, while going to Jerusalem, prophesies to the 12 his arrest, death, and resurrection, where he will metaphorically have his heel bruised as prophesied in Genesis 3:15, and literally have his face and body bruised. Verses 35 to 45, brothers Jim and Jack, which, I mean, there are a lot of James and John, so maybe calling the brothers Jim and Jack will help distinguish. They ask to sit on Jesus' sides in the kingdom, one on each. And Jesus says that they have no clue what they're asking for because they can't handle earning that by going through what he's about to go through. And then the other 10 get mad, most likely for not thinking to ask that first because, hey, we all got a selfishness issue. Then Jesus says that they're to serve, not lord over one another, as he came first to serve through the atonement. First coming is about Christ serving, the second coming is about Christ judging. And then finally, verses 46 to 52, blind beggar Bartimaeus, who was roadside between Old and New Jericho, which, Jericho, as recorded in the Old Testament, was leveled to ruins, and a new Jericho was made, but it was made down the road, not made on top of the old, like New York in Futurama. So while he was roadside between Old and New Jericho, he was crying out, Son of David, have mercy, and he was then called by Son of David, Jesus. After being rebuked, he was asked what he wants. He answered he wants sight. You kind of think, no duh, but, it's for him to express that. And he is then healed for his faith, which, yes, faith eventually gets you healing, both physical and spiritual. But not all of it is on this side of eternity. Some of it's not till the other side of eternity. So, yes, faith gets you healed, but only eventually, meaning not necessarily immediately or even before you die. And by the way, there was another blind beggar around too, as recorded in Matthew 20, but he was left out for being much less known. A lot more people were at that time around there were familiar with Bartimaeus, but not the other guy. Chapter 11 is about Palm Sunday and the beginning of Holy Monday. Verses 1 through 11, Jesus tells the disciples to go get a donkey colt and tell anyone who asks what they're doing that he needs it, and they go do this. They also take the colt's mother, as recorded in Matthew. Mark just didn't find it useful to add. And they are asked, what are they doing? And respond as Jesus said, and the guy says, oh, okay, go ahead. Because Jesus probably didn't send him to get some random guy's colt and female donkey. Probably sent him to a guy who had heard about Jesus and was for his ministry. And then Jesus sits on their cloaks on the colt and rides it into Jerusalem with people cheering and laying down palm leaves, hence Palm Sunday. Next, verses 12 to 14, Jesus supernaturally rapid withers a fig tree for having leaves, but not having fruit like it should. If a fig tree has leaves, it's supposed to have fruit, but sometimes there's a rare occasion where it doesn't, though it shouldn't. Next, verses 15 to 19, Jesus gets incredibly ticked off and ruins the sinful, scamming temple market because God really doesn't appreciate when instead of using a place of worship as a place of worship, you use it as a place to rip people off to get yourself rich. Next, verses 20 to 25, Jesus explains that he withered the tree to teach the power, but not magic, of faith. Now, with faith, one is endowed with the ability to do God's will, but only God's will. And because that power comes from God and is received through faith, you're only going to want to use it to do God's will. Just because you have faith doesn't mean you can then just do anything you want. You don't become little gods. Don't become nigh omnipotent. And I don't care what Kenneth Copeland's wife has been telling you, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you automatically or should have meteorokinesis, which is weather manipulation. Then finally, verses 27 to 33, no verse 26, because that was found out to be added in later, which when you have so many manuscripts of so many ages, it's pretty easy to find that stuff out, unlike with many other ancient documents. These verses tell us that chief priests and scribes ask Jesus where he gets his authority, and he counters with where John the Baptizer get his authority for baptism, because answering a question with a Christian, copyright Jesus, somewhere around 30 to 33 AD. And the chief priests and scribes don't answer his question because they know either answer is going to get him into trouble. A trick using a question where either answer gets you in trouble, that will be used later. So then they don't answer, and neither does Jesus. Chapter 12, the first part of it is mostly about questions. But first, verses 1 through 12, we get the tenants parable. How it goes is a man who owned a vineyard rented it to tenants and then left. And so he then sent a servant to go collect the fruit, but that servant, was beaten and sent away by the tenants. So then the man sends another servant who is then this time killed by the tenants. And then he sends other servants as well who suffer one of those two fates. They're either beaten and sent away empty-handed, or they're killed. So he finally sends his son, who is then killed. So the man retaliates, rightfully so, by killing the tenants and giving the vineyard over to others. This is a representation of how the religious leaders were entrusted, with all the writings of the Old Testament and with Scripture and with the Old Covenant, but they just would not listen to the prophets, and will eventually have the Son, Jesus, crucified. So God will punish them and will make a new covenant that will be obviously open to everyone, including Gentiles. Next, verses 13 to 17, Pharisees and Herodians, which Herodians are the pro-Herod dynasty party. So these would be guys who promote Herod Antipas's power, along with any successors in the line of Herod. They ask Jesus if they should pay Roman taxes. And he answers with saying, well, you should give to someone what they own, including God. You see, the Roman currency, denarii, or singular denarius, if I'm pronouncing it right, they were made by Caesar, given his image, and put into function by him. Well, human beings were made by God, given his image, and put into function by him. So the Roman government owns the Roman money, so you should give it to him. But your soul and everything you have is made by God, so you owe him that. And then finally, verses 18 to 27, the Sadducees, because they don't believe in the resurrection, that's why they're sad, you see. I give credit to whoever started that joke, but I don't know who it is, so sorry. Well, they ask Jesus if a woman 7 times marries a man who dies without giving her kids, whose wife she'd be in the resurrection. Again, they don't care though, because they don't really believe in the resurrection. And Jesus says that, well, she'd be no one's wife, because in the resurrection, which is when the church, which is Christ's bride, becomes metaphorically married to the bridegroom, which is him, individuals won't be willingly getting married. Like how obedient angels, same can't be said for disobedient angels. Don't believe me? Go watch the lesson titled Literal Giants to Know. Like obedient angels don't get married. Don't willingly get married. And he says that souls, even without the body, before the resurrection, are alive. Because God is God of the living, and he's God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're out of the body. The rest of the chapter is also mostly about even more questions, amongst other things though as well. Verses 28 to 34, a scribe asks Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And Jesus says that it's to love God with all you are and have. And after the scribe agrees to that and says that he is correct and shows understanding of knowing that that is correct, Jesus says that, yes, you are right to agree with what he said. Next, verses 35 to 37, Jesus shows that he, i.e. the Christ, is more than just David's son, but he's also God's son, because he's even greater than David. And he does this by using Psalm 110:1. Next, verses 38 to 40, Jesus says to beware the scribes because they're very ostentatious. They do just to get attention and to get privilege. And they also burden widows, amongst many other people, with all their legalism, with all their ritual over righteousness. And then finally, verses 41 to 44, speaking of widows, Jesus watches rich people stingily put some of their surplus into the temple treasury box, which looks something like that. So yeah, when you put the coins in there, you can really hear it clanging around that funnel. Like, ooh, you put in so much. I could tell by hearing. They did that, but then a poor widow faithfully and joyfully put in the only 2 coins she had. And Jesus says that she contributed more. Yes, because in personal value, that was much more, though not necessarily in monetary value. That doesn't mean, give all your money to a ministry and then God will bless you, like, so many prosperity gospel preachers like Joyce Meyer says to do. And, they say it without care in the world of what happens to you. The point is that when you give, you should give out of faith and give joyfully, like it says in the Pauline epistles. Don't be like these rich guys who they're just giving some of their surplus and doing so just so they can get pointers, and not at all because they're like, this is how much I want to give out of faith. No, it's how much you want to give out of showing off with no real shot to your wallet. Just give what you give, just do it out of joy and out of faith. Chapter 13 is about eschatology, which is on the subject of the end times. Verses 1 through 2, after a disciple points out the temple, Jesus prophesies its destruction, which happened in AD 70. Verses 3 through 8, we get the signs of the end's beginning, which are many false prophets and apostates, wars and rumors of them, famines and widespread earthquakes. We're told not to be scared since these are just the start. And verses 9 through 13, during the end times, Jesus' followers will be beaten and tried for his namesake, even by family, but it will be an evangelizing opportunity that God will handle. There's no need to worry, and there's salvation after it. In verses 14 through 23, after the abomination of desolation, which is Emperor Titus' army, according to Luke 21:20, the army that destroyed the temple, when it is in the temple, surrounding it and then destroying it, tribulation will occur. At some point, it will be the worst it's ever been in human history, and that time is shortened for the sake of the elect. Also, during the end times, false Christs and false prophets will arise and try to lead people astray with signs and wonders, but they mustn't be believed in, especially those saying that Christ has come or is here, so one must be on guard. Continuing on the chapter and subject, verses 24 through 27, after the tribulation, there will be no light from space shining on earth. Jesus will come in the clouds, and angels will gather his people from all over creation. Verses 28 through 31, like leaves blooming on a fig tree say summer is soon, the signs say that the end is soon. The generation at the time of Jesus saying this won't die till all these signs occur, which they did all occur by AD 70, just decades after these statements. And finally, this creation will pass, but not God's word. And then verses 32 through 37, only the divine himself, not even Jesus' humanity, no human mind, knows when the end is. That's why it could happen at any moment, even now. So one must be constantly ready, which you are if you're born again, but not at all if you aren't. Now in this video, looking at some key verses from some of these chapters, 10:6 says, "But from the beginning of creation God made them male and female." 12:27 says, "He is not God of the dead, but of the living. You are quite wrong." And 13:32 says, "But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father."